Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Grace Again podcast, an ongoing conversation with the people of Grace about church and life and culture and theology. This is beta episode number 7, recorded on Tuesday, October 18th, 2016. I'm your host, John Harris, and in this segment, I'm excited about having a conversation with 3 of my friends, Janet Wiley, Emily Manheim, and John Shook. And what I'd like to do to get started is just to introduce them and have them introduce themselves. And we're going to start with Janet. Janet, if you don't mind just introducing yourself, and I just want to say welcome to the program, and tell us just a little bit about yourself, Janet.
Thank you. Very exciting to be here.
Good.
I am a member of a Grace Community Church for 7 years. I have 4 kids, 1 husband. I've been a homeschooling mom for a long time.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
That's good. No, that's good for now. We'll just kind of keep going around. Emily, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. Yes, I'm Emily Manheim. I've been going to Grace since I was 7 years old, so kind of grown up in the family, and it's really been a great experience. I'm really thankful for Body of Christ.
Good. And lastly, John Shook, introduce yourself, John. How many kids do you have?
Hang on a second. Let me think.
Count them.
I got 4 children. My wife, Diana, on staff at Grace to work with students. We've been a part of Grace Community Church for almost 10 years, been on staff for 8 years.
Great. Yeah. Well, I welcome all 3 of you to the program and want to move quickly into our topic for this podcast episode. And in a couple of words, the topic is refugee resettlement ministry. And thinking in terms of what opportunities and maybe even responsibilities do we, the church, have when it comes to refugees. I was reading just past week a couple of questions that just came to my mind as I was reading certain articles about this. One is what exactly is a refugee? Or how do they get to the United States? Or are they screened and vetted? Or what services do they receive when they get here? And here's the last one that I read in one article. The question was, and why should I care? And that just took me to another great information as it relates to refugee resettlement. On the website of World Relief, they have an interesting paragraph that sort of summarizes it up and says, today the number of people in our world who are displaced from their homes by violence and persecution is unprecedented in human history. By the end of 2014, nearly 60 million people had been forcibly displaced, with nearly a third of them, that's 20 million, living outside of their countries as refugees. By far, the greatest force driving this crisis is Syria. Nearly half of Syria's population is thought to be displaced or killed. 4 million Syrians have now taken refuge in neighboring countries like Jordan, Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, struggling to build new lives for themselves in regions far from home. I just thought those words sort of framed up our discussion. And what I'd like to do is, from those realities, in fact, those statistics on World Relief's website may very well even be outdated as the crisis has increased even in the last, not just year, but in the last few months. If you just were to go on a website and read the news of the last few days in the middle of October 2016, you would see the news of war increasing with Russia, Syria, and the rebel armies and all that happening in the Middle East, especially in Syria, especially in Aleppo right now. It's just a hotbed of war and violence and persecution. And I think the article and I think the reality is that as a result of all that, there's just been a mass exodus of mostly Syrians, but others as well. And they end up in different countries, and some, an increasing number, end up in our own country as refugees. And that's when we come to this discussion here. Here's what I'd like to do. Janet, I'd like to go back to you and just give us a Cliff Notes version of sort of introduce us to why and where your heart and your involvement in refugee resettlement ministry has brought you? Not all the details, but just sort of a 140-character tweet, kind of just like quickly. What has brought you, and how would you characterize your interest or involvement in this ministry? Just take a couple minutes and describe that.
Well, I've always had an interest in missions. My life has not really played out in order to be able to go and be a missionary cross-cultural abroad. This is just an opportunity that is here. You know, I've watched the news. I've seen about the war. I've seen about the refugees. My heart breaks for those people. And to know that they're here, my community is amazing. And like immediately when John told my husband about it, I was like, oh yeah, I want to be part of that.
Yeah.
Just down the street.
Yeah. Now, Janet, did John tell Jeff like months and years ago, or has this been a recent thing that's really entered into your life? I'm just trying to get a context of how long you've been sort of wading into this water.
Well, I think John first mentioned it this summer.
Okay.
You know, it hasn't only been to the last few weeks. And there was an urgency with the other church that was sponsoring families that they have a need, like they are maxed out. And, you know, they're asking John for a support. And, you know, immediately, you know, having known about it, I'm ready to go.
Good. That's exciting. Emily, let's hand the baton to you for the same kind of question, just sort of a quick, you know, Cliff Notes version of your interest or involvement and why.
Yeah, well, I was serving overseas in North Africa the last 4 years, and really just God just put a real love in my heart for Arabs. And yeah, I'm like Janet, it just breaks my heart to hear the stories of what's happening in the Middle East. And so I just, yeah, I was really praying as I was coming back to the States that there would be opportunities to get involved in helping refugees. I just think about when I was living in North Africa, the people were so warm and welcoming to me and hospitable and really helped me kind of learn my way around when I didn't speak the language.
Right.
So I just think it's an opportunity to kind of give back in a sense to their people and just help them as they're coming over, but they have so much more trauma and just be Jesus to them in this time.
Yeah, that's great. That's so clear as you describe that. I can just visualize your ministry there and then coming back to your own home and realizing, wow, it's right here in my backyard. Excellent. Shook, what are some of your thoughts on the same question? Just sort of a quick interest of yours.
I think I have to initially go back to even when I was in seminary and God just putting interest in my mind and heart just about Islam and Muslims and trying to understand that world. And then visiting a North African country, a Muslim country, a couple of years ago, that with a combination of what you see on the media, the devastating pictures that just are gut-wrenching of families being torn apart, loved ones being killed, just the amount of loss of life. It's overwhelming and you feel so helpless. And then a big factor as well has been my brother-in-law, Brian, my wife Diana's brother, and his family. Brian is a missions pastor at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church in Marietta, and Johnson Ferry is leading the way really for Georgia, possibly even maybe in the country for refugee resettlement ministry, and Brian playing a firsthand role in that. And so he has brought me and my family into this with he and his family. And so the opportunities that me personally and my kids and my wife to interact with Syrian refugees, some of them that were the very first ones here in Georgia, and just seeing these people and seeing just the deep gratitude that they have and just feeling overwhelmed with compassion for them. All of those things really contributed to my desire to move our church towards getting involved, because we do live in an unprecedented time in terms of refugee resettlement. I mean, there's always been refugees since the beginning of the world, civilization, but we're living in a very unique time, and I think that that calls the church up to an action. We need to take action.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leads me to the question that was on my mind, even as you were sharing that. You literally finished by saying the church needs to take action, which is really the beginning part of the answer to the question I asked earlier: why should I care? John, why don't you continue to elaborate on some of your heart and passion and commitment and just desire and vision, continuing, to talk about like your brother-in-law Brian, but like what about us at Grace Community Church, and why should we care on different levels?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are some of your thoughts on why should we care and be involved in this refugee resettlement?
Yeah, well, I'll speak specifically to something that's unique as far as us as a church of why we should care. There's all sorts of organizations and NGOs that are helping, whether it's overseas in Western Europe and this kind of stuff, or even here in the States helping refugees. But I think we have to look at it from a biblical perspective and through the eyes of Christ and the calling that he has on his church and for us as Christians to answer the question, well, why should we care? And we should definitely care because throughout the scriptures, it's very clear that God has a heart and a burden for the refugee, for the immigrant. You see it throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament. These words of strangers and aliens, of God when he in the Old Covenant with Israel, how he had covenanted with his people, and they were to specifically take care of those who were not part of Israel, who were among them, to watch out for them, to not oppress them like the other pagan countries were doing, but to instead be a light for the Gentiles and bless them. And you think of Israel itself, God's covenant people, they were refugees. 400 years in Egypt. Wow. And you track their progression all the way through the Old Testament. And then you go to, recently I heard an excellent sermon by Bryant Wright about refugees and immigrants. And he made a statement that, Jesus Christ, our Savior, was the most famous refugee in the history of the world, as his family fled a crazy megalomaniac King Herod, and they fled to Egypt to get away from this king who wanted to kill all the children to try to hunt down the Messiah. So you have that as the backdrop from a biblical understanding, and then you look at the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul in the New Testament of where Jesus says in Matthew of whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. Right. And we're commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the reality is that our government is bringing these people in and among us, and we have, not only can we meet the physical needs, but man, we can show the light of the gospel to these people where years ago, you could not be a Christian in their country. So many have little to no understanding of Christianity, much less of who Jesus Christ is, and here they're on our doorstep. And so I think, man, God has, in his amazing sovereignty and wisdom and compassionate care for all people, he has used these terrible wars to bring people to other countries where they can hear the message of Jesus. And, our ultimate hope would be that they would find salvation in Christ. Yeah, absolutely. Our God is known in the scriptures and throughout redemptive history of taking what other evil men mean for evil and using it for good and intending it for good. And I think you just described that in these refugees and how in the atrocious, terrible situations, what an opportunity that we have. The same thing applies with his care and compassion for his own son, as you described, escaping the political
grip of Jesus's birth, day and week, all the way to the cross, and how a Roman cross was evil men meaning for evil, but God using it for good. So, John, I really appreciate your perspective and your heart and really grounding this conversation and our ministry forward, not just merely in human need, but really in the ways of God and the scriptures themselves. And so I appreciate you sharing that. I'm going to move over back to Emily, if that's okay. Emily, I'm curious to know how your time in North Africa, even as you look back in a brief few months, or you haven't been back long, how your time there and your experience, your real life experiences there, may very well have prepared you for this type of refugee resettlement ministry. You understand the question?
Yeah, I think so. I would say, in some ways, in some ways I feel like I know what they're going through, and being in a whole new country with a new language and not knowing what's going on. When I first settled in North Africa, there were just times when I'd be walking down the street and I had no clue where I was, and I would have to just stop and ask someone for directions. And people were so helpful and kind to me.
Are you there, Emily? We might have lost Emily, and maybe she'll come back on in just a moment. Why don't we scoot over to Janet and continue that same conversation? Tell us a little bit more specifically, Janet, what you are actually doing and how you are involved. What did you say, for the last few weeks or so?
Well, actually, just last week was the first time that we, as a church body, had any beginning of introduction. So Emily Mannheim, another lady, Candy Patesold, and myself, we all went over to meet this newly resettled family. They're the most new, as I recall, and just to start to see what their needs are, kind of get a vibe for their family, like where the kids are, where they'll be in school, what their language ability is. And of course, Candy is a professional English teacher, so she was right away, kind of really had a good grasp on what to do. And then Emily translated a lot of our conversation back and forth, and I just kind of smiled and tried to be nice and, do what I could do. Use Google Translate to say what I could say. And then on Thursday, we went back over for our first official English lesson. That would be Candy and myself. Again, Candy took the lead, but, I helped out. I filled in where I could. And it was a joy to be over with them and very interesting. So we're starting to get their schedule, like finding out what their needs are, when they're available, and like trying to fit it with our schedules when we are available also, and trying to mesh. We're told that the American government says they must have at least 2 English lessons a week. Okay. And so that's something that it's a must. And that's definitely it's time, but most of us can help. There's curriculum to follow, and it's very doable. Yeah. And they're trying hard to learn.
Really?
The family.
Okay. So you get a sense of their effort is they're really trying to learn the language and the customs of the U.S.
Well, certainly the language. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it'll play out. In particular, we spent the most time with the mother of the house, but it was made known to us that it's not expected that she'll leave the house, which was interesting, by her husband. So, how much will she have that English practice, put into real life? I'm not sure. But she did express a desire for friendship for her children, her daughter in particular, who's having a hard time adjusting. Just like my daughter would, in fact, I brought my 13-year-old over to meet her daughter, but unfortunately her daughter wasn't there that second day. But anyhow, just they want relationships.
Wow. Yeah. Now, how far away is this person from your house? Are we talking like, a half an hour to an hour drive, or what? I'm just curious to know proximity.
Oh, a half hour from my house, but very close to the Shooks, or from Emily, because I'm in Ackworth, but it's in Marietta, just central Marietta, Roswell Road.
Yeah. Very,
5 minutes.
very good. Emily, you're back. I'm glad to have you back in the
I'm
conversation.
sorry. I had accidentally pressed mute with my, sorry about that.
That's okay. Hey, we're just having a great conversation here. I mean, Janet filled right in on some of the things that you're doing, but let's go back to you, Emily, and continue your part of your conversation about, your time in North Africa and how you're seeing that may very well help you in this ministry.
Sure. Yeah. I think in some ways I can relate to what they're going through being new to a place, just because when I first went to North Africa, everything was completely new. The culture is different, and you don't speak the language. You don't really always know what's going on. So I feel like that's given me a lot of compassion for them, just knowing like, oh, yeah, I know you must feel so lost right now, and I really just want to encourage them. And then as well, the language is a real gift to be able to talk with them. The dialects are not exactly the same. So I was with the family today, and so there's some times where we're totally understanding each other and sometimes where we're totally not. But I don't think they really care. I think they just, like Janet said, it's about relationships. So they just want to see that, like, we care about them and we want to talk with them. And so, I feel like, it's just really exciting to be able to be a part of this, like literally in our backyard in Marietta. And, but I just think, that as well, living in their culture, I can understand some of the things that might be difficult for them just because it's so different culturally, or some things that might be easier, so that has helped, I think, as well, to kind of have an insight into what they might struggle with.
Yeah. And what about just the whole Arab/Muslim way of life? And you lived among them, and now they are, especially ones from Syria are here. What is the? How can you help us as U.S. citizens know how to relate and approach them and minister to them, especially having known that way of life that they live?
Well, I think the biggest difference that jumps into my mind is just time. I feel like in their culture, there's more time for relationships, to be with people, to sit down and have coffee and just talk. I think there's differences in our, like, just with religion and everything. But at the end of the day, I really feel like we don't need to be afraid of those differences. We should just really love them. And if you make a cultural faux pas, if they're seeing your love for them, they're really not going to be upset, I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, I've made quite a few in my days. I've never had anyone be like, oh, Emily, that was wrong. They were always very gracious.
Yeah.
So I think that would be, just not to be afraid, to embrace them. And then also to have time, because, they really value just your presence. You don't even need to have the language to be able to talk with them. Just if you came and sat down and had tea with them, that really means a lot in their culture. So
you mean just sitting down having tea and like silence? Like how can you talk at all?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, even that, because like when I was first in North Africa, I could not speak the language, and I would go and hang out with people, and we probably wouldn't sit in silence. We would look at photos of our family, or but really they were just happy to have me there, even if I couldn't say anything. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Emily, you mentioned just a minute ago, we really don't need to be afraid to make mistakes with them with regard to culture faux pas or whatever you were saying. We need to really not be afraid. But what about the fear of Muslims in general giving our culture of terrorism around the world, and even some in our own country here? as we consider involvement in this. I'm like asking you because you've lived in a culture in a country where there's very much the threat of that in different ways all around, and you know these people, these Muslim people, and yet sometimes our news headlines can define the issue and define the day and speak into our minds and hearts in a very overwhelming, prevailing kind of way. So you spoke of fear of not embarrassing yourself, but what about fear of danger?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I would say first, the majority, because we hear the news and the headlines, we can start to think that the majority of Muslims are hostile or the majority of Muslims are, terrorists. And it's really not the case. I mean, I would say, yes, there are terrorists, but that's probably a minority of the majority.
Yeah.
So I think we need to keep that in mind. And then as well, I think as believers, we're not called to live in fear, and, perfect love casts out all fear, and we're not given a spirit of fear or timidity, So I just think we need to kind of remember these promises and what God says about who we are, and not be afraid to step out in love, because I think it is just such a great opportunity. And then, like John was saying earlier, even just to be able to share Jesus with these people, because they haven't probably heard the gospel. And as well, because they're refugees and they're so vulnerable right now, when we are going over and having a cup of tea with them or helping them enroll in school, it means so much. And I think that that love is really going to open doors for the gospel in the future. So,
wow.
Yeah, so I don't want us to be afraid and miss these things that God has put in our laps,
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
What a way to share it. That's awesome. Just don't miss that opportunity. John, I want to ask you one last question, if that's okay. If you could maybe just from your perspective summarize some of what Janet was already sharing by her own testimony, by her own involvement. What is the scope of possibilities or opportunities here that we might have as a church? Like, give us some examples. Give us some sense of how we individually or as a family or as a church family can get involved here in the weeks and months ahead. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Before I answer that, let me just add one thing to something that both Janet and Emily have mentioned. In as much as there are cultural differences, which there absolutely are, one thing I have noticed is in interacting with whether it's Muslims overseas or refugees here, I mean, they're just like us in the sense of, they want to, husbands want to provide for their families. Moms are worried about their kids. They don't want their kids to fall in with the wrong crowd. They struggle with discipline with their kids. I mean, all these sorts of things that are such commonality that we don't have to stretch our minds to understand that. We deal with that every day. And so, now granted, they've had these other factors that we haven't of, losing many loved ones and from war and persecution and things like that. But nonetheless, it's good to also keep in mind that as much as we're very different, we're very similar in we want to have good marriages. We want to have healthy, strong kids, and those are easy common ground to find with people.
Yeah. Wow.
But as far as our church, your specific question again, John, was just how are we looking to get involved? Is that?
Yeah, and I would just add this to it. Not only maybe how we might look to get involved, but what is your understanding of just the variety of ways that Johnson's Ferry and others are being involved here? So we have some sort of scope of the need and the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, that the need and opportunity isn't, and when you hear the news more recently, you've seen how, ISIS is losing ground, losing territory, and so maybe we've kind of gone over the hump of this thing, and it's going to start, these issues aren't going to be an issue in a year or so, but that's actually not the case. The people that I've talked with have said, next year, from my understanding, the U.S. is planning on bringing over 100,000 refugees to the United States, which this year they've only done about 10,000 or 15,000 or so. So, I mean, the need is only going to increase from here. So, in light of that, I think that we do have a great opportunity to connect with organizations that are involved directly with the government, and I think Janet mentioned it. It's a little bit of a tricky thing because you're talking about, our United States government brings the refugees over and they vet them. They have a process that they go through, which I'll just mention. 60 Minutes did an excellent news story just this past Sunday on what is the vetting process for any refugees, not just Syrian, but anyone else. And it's really remarkable. I encourage folks to go to 60 Minutes online. I'm sure you can watch that segment. So the government works with all sorts of, whether it's a parachurch ministry or any other kind of organization, they partner with them to bring the refugee families over. And then the one that we're specifically looking at is World Relief, which has an office here in Atlanta. And so it would be a process of us developing a partnership with World Relief and using Johnson Ferry Baptist Church as a sort of shoulder to lean on, because they've been doing this for almost a year now. And really I'll say this, it's easy to romanticize the idea of helping refugees, especially in light of the things you see in the news, and we can help, we can rescue, but the process of really helping these families is a very long one. It can be very involved at times. It takes a real team effort, a group of people that are committed to these families, because like Emily was saying, I mean, they're leaving they're fleeing. That's the difference between an immigrant and a refugee. A refugee is fleeing, an immigrant comes of their own sort of free will, but they're fleeing from all they've ever known, and they get planted here, and so their whole world has been changed. And so it is a long process and a long commitment, and so that's why we as a church want to look at and talk more with World Relief and build a partnership with them, that we can be one of their partner churches, as they have many partner churches. And so there's going to be many more opportunities in the future for our church as we move forward, as well as the churches here in Atlanta and all over the U.S. as more keep coming in the country. Wow,
that's good. Well, Janet, we probably need to wrap up our program. I'm just kind of curious to know a couple of closing thoughts from each of you, if you care to share anything else. For you, Janet, I'm kind of curious to know if you what are your plans moving forward? Like when you think about the future of continuing involvement here, because you've only scratched the surface and just jumped in, right?
Absolutely, there is so much. It could go so deep.
Yeah. And so you're a mom with 4 children, and one's left the home, but
right.
The second one's kind of on her way out, sort of, right? I mean, it's like your kids are growing up, and what do you see, and why stay involved, and what are your hopes and dreams for this, for you and your family?
Well, yes, I'm experiencing some more freedom, so that is freeing me up to be able to be involved more, which I'm thankful for. I'm hoping in the future more so, be more free. Maybe that would be my heart, if we can just, keep things as they are in the house, and then I'm not needed. And I can go out. That's what I would love to do, and be really way more involved in, the whole relief process. I don't know. I just seriously, I'll watch the news and be like, like a frustration that I can't do anything about it. Now, like, if they're here, absolutely. If I can help. And it's just, I love international people. So, and I grew up, in Michigan, and, there's a lot of Muslims in Michigan. In fact, when we were over there, they immediately recognized Michigan, like that I was from, and they Skyped us into the refugee camp in Jordan to meet their family over Skype. And he's like, and this is Janet from Michigan. And they're like, Michigan! Wow. It was hilarious that, in Jordan, they know Michigan. And, so, I mean, actually, I, grew up really with a lot of, Middle Easterners around. Didn't really think anything about it, but yeah.
Wow. So it's kind of fun to look back on your life and see how God, in his forethought, knew and could see how certain circumstances would come to play later in life. And here you are with this opportunity and jumping in to minister to people that, quite frankly, are maybe very similar to the ones that, in Michigan you grew up with all around you. Yeah, absolutely. Now, do you see, in what way do you see this involvement affecting or wanting to minister to your own children as they are involved? Do you plan on including any or all of them in some sort of way?
I would like to, very much hope to. And I brought my daughter over the other day in hopes that she and the other little girl could connect. I definitely, broaden their mind. With my son going to the military, I kept telling him, I want you to embrace everyone. You're going to have so many different people from outside our little homeschool world, Yeah. It's going to be so varied. And I want you to be able to embrace everyone. I just feel like that with all my kids. I want them to have opportunity to understand the world and understand God's heart for the world. And, know how to serve also and to love. Serve and to love.
Yeah.
It's just lessons that sometimes are hard to come by, when we just do our soccer teams and stuff,
Right.
But no, to serve and to love.
Well, these are things we teach our children, and we desire and hope and plan and are committed to teaching our children with our words and to telling them. But then what a powerful thing it is to add opportunity, real life opportunity, to add to the teachings of Jesus and what we know to be right and true and good, an opportunity to actually put it into action and to learn even on an even deeper level what it means like to walk that path of inconvenience or putting others first or identifying with someone else. I mean, Emily, you've demonstrated that in going on a ship around the world and then living in a country in northern Africa and landing there and saying, this is not home, we're not in Kansas anymore. And it's like you're putting yourself out there to identify with the struggles and the way of life of someone else. So, Janet, I really so appreciate your perspective there as a mom and just wanting your family, wanting your kids to invite them in, to not just know head knowledge, to know the answers, the Sunday school answers, so to speak, but to know Jesus by walking with him and into opportunity like this. Yeah. I mean, I think one of our church members, Dan Burton, as he's worked with and served with Samaritan's Purse, he repeats it frequently when he says, here's what Christians do. They don't run away from danger. They run to it to help people in need. And I'm so encouraged by that. Emily, are you still there?
I am, yes.
Yeah. Do you have some closing thoughts for us as we wrap up our podcast?
Well, I'm just very excited, honestly, about this opportunity. And, I was with the family today, and it was really special just spending time with them. I'm hoping personally to get to know them better and kind of build a relationship with the mom. I was thinking, it was mentioned earlier, like that she might not be able to leave the house much, but, that doesn't mean that she can't have visitors,
Yeah.
And, there's really, it is a real relationship value, or my words are getting all jumbled. It's a culture that really values relationships. So, there's opportunity to build relationships and just show love. And, I feel really thankful too, personally, just coming back from living overseas in that culture. It's kind of comforting meeting with the Syrian family and almost experiencing a bit of home, as you could say, because it was my home overseas. So yeah, that's been a real blessing to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when Janet shared the story about, she heard at least that the wife might not be able to leave the home, and she said because the husband said she couldn't or whatever, and that might very well be out of protection. I mean, they're in a foreign land, and he might be just being a good protector. But can you identify with that, Muslim family, and does that kind of resonate with your experience in the last couple years, Emily?
Yeah, I think that kind of thing really does depend on the family and the marriage and everything. But I also think from the standpoint of she just has a lot of responsibilities in the home. Mm-hmm. There is the roles of women in the home, like, to be taking care of the kids mm-hmm. and cooking dinner. And so it might have as well just been that she herself didn't see herself going out a lot. Well, I mean, where I was living, women definitely went out and met with friends, and they would do a lot of things together. Even if it's like shopping for groceries, they go out with a friend and do that. So, yeah it might be, but it could be definitely from a protecting standpoint as well. Because I think when they look at America, they might be quite scared because they've watched TV and seen like really kind of what we would say like scandalous TV shows, and they think that's America. So they might be afraid to like let their kids just go out and meet other kids because they might think that we're all gonna, they might just think, oh, these teenagers are all out drinking and they're gonna corrupt my children, or just because the idea in their mind might be different. So
that's interesting.
I think they'll get to know families and they'll see. So
now clarification for both of you. You both are speaking of a family. Is this the same family that
yes.
So our church is really up to now, right now, only involved with one family, and you two and some others are ministering to that family. Is that a way to understand it right now?
Yes.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah. And me and Candy Patesfold has really been helping a lot as well. So
Right. Well, I'm assuming that the opportunity would be not only to go deeper and more extensive with this family, but also what about other families? I mean, the needs I'm assuming can be overwhelming, right? As you help them transition.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think so.
John Shook mentioned that it's really a long-term help. It's the resources of time and the personal connection, and also like help with things in the house, like like furniture, as they're setting up the households, like if the multiple families, there's a lot, and it's very long term seeing them through the adjustment. So I think that there's lots of time just for this one family, and then more to come.
Absolutely. Well, Janet, Emily, John, if you're still there, I want to thank you for sharing. You're still there, okay? John,
hey, John, let me.
Since you are still there, do you have one last thing to share?
Yeah. Let me just clarify one thing, just for anybody that might be listening and be a little bit confused. So Janet and Emily and Candy are helping this family on behalf of Johnson Ferry Baptist Church because they needed help with this new family.
Okay.
So what we're looking to do at Grace Community Church is essentially doing what Johnson Ferry is doing, but just to make that clear that this family is not connected with Grace Community, it's through Johnson Ferry, and so these three ladies are helping out with that family through Johnson Ferry.
Yeah, and so to make your last comment even more clear, when you say that our church would like to do what Johnson's Ferry is doing, what you mean is that we as a church want to prayerfully consider helping a completely different family with some of their transition. Is that accurate?
Yep.
Okay,
that's accurate. And last thing I'll say, just because I feel like everything I've said has been so heavy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of fun. I mean, I just had this memory of just like 3 or 4 weeks ago, I'm sitting with this one family, Syrian family. The husband's name is Samir, and I'm at my nephew's football game. And so we're watching my nephew play football. He's in high school. And so, kind of explaining the game to him and his kids. And next thing I know, and Samir's this big guy, and he's like sitting so close to me because they have personal like space differences than we do, and we're laughing about something, and he like grabs my hand and like interlocking fingers for a couple minutes, like we're just sitting there holding hands, and but it was just like totally. Yeah, I know, Emily, you guys are totally cracking up.
I'm like, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that stuff is like it's fun. I mean, it really gets you outside of your own comfort zone in such a good way.
Yeah, I'll say.
And so I just want to close with that. But
that's great. Good way to close, John. Well, I appreciate all three of you, not only your time that you've invested in sharing with through this podcast, but all that you're doing to take the initiative to get this ministry started in our church and working with Johnson's Ferry right now. Any closing thoughts? I just don't want to end our podcast unless anybody has anything else to say. Going once, going twice. Well, Janet, Emily, John, thank you so much. I'm going to let you sign off now, and I appreciate so much your time. And for the remaining of our podcast, I just wanted to challenge all those who heard and listened to this podcast to really seriously, prayerfully consider everything that they've shared and what you've heard, and just go before the Lord individually and as a family, and just ask Him, how do you want me to be involved? In what way can I serve? Be challenged by that initial question of why should I care, and take to heart some of the things these three have shared by way of their own testimony, but also by way of the Scriptures and how the Lord has called us to serve in this way. I can't help but to think that if what you're saying is true, Shook, that this is only the beginning. There are going to be many more thousands of refugees coming to our land. And so for an entire few years or even a decade or a generation, we could have this opportunity. But to think that the church in America had this opportunity in their back door, in their backyard, and we didn't really do anything about it. We just merely went about our business in our own way with our own lives, and squandered this opportunity to not only meet their physical needs and help them in the needs they have in this world, but in the midst of that relationship, sharing the timeless message of the gospel, many of whom would hear for the very first time a clear presentation about Jesus, who really was born and lived, died, and rose again much closer to their homeland than all the way in the United States. So they've come all the way to the United States, and yet if we do not take this opportunity to share the gospel and to minister to them, I think we will be held accountable to that, because so much has been deposited into the Christians in the West, into the United States of America, and to think we don't have to spend millions of dollars to go back to the mission field there, but they're right here on our doorstep. So may we know the grace of God and that we've received, and be servants who are passionately committed to helping others become passionate followers of Jesus Christ, all to the glory of God, because God has revealed and made Himself known to us, pouring His grace out into our lives. I think about that verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, whereby Paul says, we want to extend grace to more and more people so that thanksgiving and praise may increase. And so that's a real exhortation and challenge that we have from listening to Janet, Emily, and John Shook tonight. This brings our episode to a close. Thanks so much for joining us. I look forward to our next episode. Stay tuned for listening in on the podcast as we are able to present and share more and more grace with one another and through the body of Christ. Thanks for joining us.